My friends, hello and thank you for your loyalty to this channel. Today we're going to talk about theft. Latam 2213 Latam is a Chilean airline that operates mainly in Latin America and it's present in many countries. But today we are in Lima, Peru at Hugo Chavez Airport in November 2022. We are around the time when COVID is ending and operations are starting to pick up again at Hugo Chavez Airport. And that's very important for this story. Well, it's upside down. Why? Because historically, it was an airport that had only one runway, so just one runway, 3,600 meters. And then facilities like terminals, hangars, and firefighters. But the problem is that once it started to grow in traffic, it had to be expanded, it had to be made bigger. So to the west of the airport, we added another runway. Well, we were in the process of adding another runway. So there were a lot of tractors, trucks, excavators, plus a sea of cones separating everything. Actually, the part we'll call the old airport and the part that's the new airport, which wasn't in operation yet, was still under construction. So you'll see right away that it's not a very promising situation, because there are conflicts between the part that's in operation and the part that isn't. The authority of the air traffic controllers stopped at the borders of the cones. In reality, they stopped at the old airport since the new one wasn't in service yet. So they were outside their jurisdiction. So, in November 2022, I was saying that the firefighters had decided to carry out a drill. They regularly conducted drills. Why? Because there was the following situation. At the time when the airport had only one runway, there was a fire station. And then, well, they did regular training so they could reach, let's say, the farthest point from their fire station. In less than 3 minutes, stopwatch in hand, it was very important to validate this through regular drills. Now, once the airport expanded, they couldn't keep their old fire station because this time the farthest point of the airport, if you take the end of the new runway, was more than 5 kilometers away. So what did they do? They set up a new fire station somewhere between the two runways in the middle. They set up a station that is roughly equidistant from all the runway thresholds. Now, they regularly did drills to see how long it took them to reach one of the points farthest from their station. And then stopwatch and all that and making reports and everything the day before. Isn't that the drill we're talking about today? Did they? Their supervisor called air traffic control to explain to them. He spoke to a supervisor and told him, well, so tomorrow we're going to do a drill, all that. The two men talked. There was some sort of understanding between them. The next day, the day of the drill, the guy we talked to the day before, well, he wasn't there. He was sick that morning, so he didn't come. So here we have people who don't really know there's a drill, at least just to be sure. The fire chief calls the control tower at the beginning of the afternoon to once again explain that there's a drill. He reaches someone who replies, I wasn't aware of that. All right. He explains once again that there will be a drill and that fire trucks will be going right to the threshold of runway 34. So the supervisor gives his approval and he will explain this to the controller. So he explained it to the air traffic controller in the tower. He will tell them in a moment we are going to have a drill and everything except that the drill. They were told to do it between 3 and 4 o'clock the day before. Why? Because they were told during that time slot, well, that's when there's the least amount of traffic. So if you want to bother people as little as possible, do it during that time slot. So they wait until after 3 o'clock to start the drill, except that, well, at 3 o'clock, what happens? There was a shift change, so several controllers were going to rotate and all that. So the controllers who knew there was a drill were absolutely going to be replaced by others who didn't know about it. So we're really in a situation where the further we go, the less we know, as Dutronc used to say. So at one point, shortly after 3 o'clock, just before starting the drill, the fire chief gets into his command vehicle. He gets to the cones. Remember, the cones mark the jurisdiction boundary. He gets to the cones and calls control to say, yes, hi. Well, it's for the drill. I'm going to remove the cones. The other person says, cone? Yes, I'm at this place, but where are you? Well, yes, I'm in front of the building of such and such company, but wait, tell me that again. Well, I can't find it. So what's terrible here, is that we have a supervisor who's responsible for the installations. And we have a contact person who calls him who's very vague and seems confused on the phone. Because the conversation, well, it goes around in circles. Even at one point, the air traffic controller grabs binoculars and scans the distance, trying to identify his contact and the cone to remove. But it's a conversation that doesn't get anyone anywhere. There's confusion on both the controller's side and the firefighter's side, but why is there confusion? Well, there's a reason. The airport is new, yes, because previously the airport operated for decades with only one runway and all that. And it was the same taxiways, the same routes, the same ones, so everyone knew the airport layout. Everyone on the tarmac had it memorized, so when discussing taxiways and other topics, they knew exactly what they meant. Except now the airport has been expanded. So we have taxiways that haven't been mapped yet, others that are on maps but nobody has studied and so on. So it actually creates confusion on both sides. And what's terrible is that we have this controller. As I said, he knows someone who wants to remove the cones and enter the facilities or bring in vehicles. And despite the fact that the message isn't getting through, well, he still allows him to do it. So here we missed an opportunity, and probably the last one, to avoid the tragedy. So at a certain point, one of the vehicles, the command vehicle, arrives at the threshold of runway 34. And what does he do? He picks up his radio and calls his troops. He tells them accident or plane on fire at the threshold of runway 34. That was the peak, that was go. At that moment, he had to start and get to him, be in front of him in less than 3 minutes stopwatch. So, understand one thing. From the moment we're in a mindset of we're in a race against the clock. Clearly, so you have to get there very quickly. Which means that the firefighters, they're going to start with their truck, right? With their Panther, well, they're going to start. Pedal to the metal. These heavy trucks can still reach speeds of 140 kilometers per hour. And so they don't have time to stop in their mindset. They're not here to stop, brake, any of that. So they have this impression, there's usually some confusion. They have this impression that they've been allowed to go up to the edge of the runway and also to cross or enter it. But normally, when you're on an airport platform, the runways are sacred, and to cross them, there are certain rules. For example, if an aircraft lands and needs to reach the terminal, it may have to cross a runway, correct? The pilot switches to the tower frequency, requests permission to cross the runway, and is granted. He crosses over, then switches back to ground control. It's sacred. You can't just enter a runway like that. Except that these various trucks crashed into truck number 3, which was in the lead. Well, obviously their drivers or their crews thought things were clear for them. Now, at the other end of the runway, this time we're at the 16 end of that runway. Well, at that end, there's an Airbus A320neo. The registrations start with C Charlie. That's a Chilean registration, so it's Latam flight 2213. There are 108 people on board, so that plane, Salim. The pilots are talking with the control tower. They are on a different frequency than where the firefighters and ground controller communicated. And then, well, they are cleared for takeoff. They're told, well, the wind is calm, go ahead. So, once the controller gives his blessing, the pilots throttle up and start accelerating. Visually, it's broad daylight and we're in visual flight conditions. Visual meteorological conditions means we're in visual flight conditions in broad daylight at 3 post-meridian. And there's no weather phenomenon. They reduce visibility, and at that moment, the runway is clear. Except that at the moment when the pilots push the throttles forward to takeoff position, at that moment, a group of fire trucks starts up from the fire station and rushes toward the runway. So the plane accelerates. It speeds down the runway, passes its V1 speed, and reaches 131 knots. All right, we're literally just seconds away from lifting off the ground. And at that moment, suddenly the pilots see a dark truck with its flashing light on speeding toward the runway. And at the speed it's going, they realize it isn't going to stop. As for the truck driver, the plane is coming from his left, but he's focused on the right because his intention is to enter the runway, turn right to go to the other threshold, to threshold 16, to threshold 34, while the plane is coming from the left, it's coming from threshold 16. So it was inevitable. That means there was no way to avoid this collision. There was no way to pull the plane off the ground. That might have been a very bad idea. Besides, there was no way to brake, given the speed. Well, yes, there was a way to brake, except at that speed, the plane would probably need about a kilometer to stop. So it was VINI impact. What will happen is that the right engine will hit the cab of the truck. Actually, the truck had started to make its turn. It was at about a 45-degree angle during its turn. And the right engine hits the cab from the rear left and strikes it. The engine is torn off. The plane catches fire, actually. The right wing catches fire. And when the aircraft starts to skid, the landing gear breaks. And then, by some sort of miracle, the fire, a huge fire, doesn't get inside the cabin, so the aircraft eventually comes to a stop. And I almost want to tell you that the firefighters are there immediately. You can't really say, fortunately, they're there. Because ideally, we would have preferred that they weren't there at all. Actually, we did prefer that there were no firefighters at all. But well, that's how it is. Unfortunately, he crashed into one of the trucks, but in a way, fortunately, there was a line of people in that truck that was just arriving, and they will intervene immediately. So they will start spraying foam on the aircraft. The pilots contact the control tower and the controller confirms, yes, there's a fire at the back. However, I see two trucks that are coming toward you. At any moment, they order the evacuation. The slides are deployed on the side where there is no fire, and then people start to evacuate. The crew was yelling at them to evacuate, but also to leave their luggage behind. Of course, the captain was the last one to get out. Everyone got out of the plane. There were 108 people, so 108 got out. Even though some were injured during the impact, during the evacuation, some were hit by the flames. There were still some hospitalizations, some of them serious, requiring several months in the hospital. Although there were no deaths on the plane, it was still very serious. The firefighters, one of the trucks goes to check on number 3. I told you about truck number 3, well, this one. Unfortunately, on board, there were 4 people, and out of the 4, 3 died, and 1 is between life and death. This last one will be evacuated. He will be in a coma, and he will stay in the hospital for 7 months before passing away. So still, the accident caused 4 deaths. It was the firefighters who were in truck number 3. Now, something outrageous is going to happen. That is to say, the police show up and then the drivers are arrested. The drivers are immediately arrested. They aren't allowed to see a doctor, even after experiencing a shock. There's probably physical and psychological trauma, meaning one of them hit his head, breathed in smoke. Others as well, who were the last ones to get out. So not even taking them to the hospital or anything right away. You hit firefighters, you killed firefighters, it's your fault. Straight to the cell, so they are arrested. And this caused a shock around the world. The accident is understandable, but the response to it is a different matter. Contrary to the safety standards applied around the world, which goes against International Civil Aviation Organization standards. And Peru is still a signatory country. So they spent the night in jail and were only released the following evening. There was no charge held against them. We later learn in the investigation that they were completely within their rights, that the road was an airstrip, not a fireman's road. And then they were there like a fish out of water, right? It was an airstrip that was being used properly and regularly. They had permission and were in the process of taking off. There was no way, there was no malice, there was no way for them to avoid the impact. And the problem was the firefighters who rushed in. Like how do you say, like a bull in a china shop? Well, I don't remember what kind of pins. And actually, they rushed in there and then they took the plane. The plane, of course, was destroyed, and truck number 3 was also destroyed. The airport was out of operation for a day or two before business resumed. So there you have it, my friends. I wanted to tell you to finish that in aviation, when there's a communication problem, that's where accidents happen. The evil fairy of the accident is hidden in the story. Confusing work, lack of knowledge of the field by everyone, shifts changing, the guy who's sick but doesn't communicate before leaving, emails that should have been sent to some people but weren't sent. All of it created a foundation. And just the fact that we stopped the pilots might give you a pretty good idea of the safety culture that exists in that place. Thank you for watching this video so far. Let me remind you about my book, Escrologie, which you can find on Amazon. Thanks to everyone supporting this channel on Patreon. Without them, it wouldn't exist. Thanks again, and I'll see you in the next one.